March 19th, 1967. Dawn broke over War Zone C in Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost peaceful. But there was nothing peaceful about War Zone C. This was the black heart of Viet Cong territory, 90 kilometers northwest of Saigon, a place where the enemy ruled supreme, where American forces ventured only in strength and even then faced constant danger. The locals had abandoned this region years ago. The villages were empty, burned out, reclaimed by jungle. The only people who lived here now were those who wore the black pajamas and carried AK-47s, the soldiers of the Viet Cong's 9th Division. Operation Junction City was the largest American military operation of the war to date. General William Westmoreland, commanding all U.S. forces in Vietnam, had committed over 25,000 troops to this massive sweep through War Zone C. The goal was audacious, perhaps even impossible. Find and destroy the Central Office for South Vietnam, the communist headquarters that directed the entire insurgency in the southern half of the country. Capture or kill the political and military leadership of the Viet Cong, disrupt their base areas, destroy their supply caches, drive them out of their sanctuary. The operation's design was clever on paper. American units would form a horseshoe-shaped cordon around a suspected enemy base area. The 173rd Airborne Brigade held one side. The 2nd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, held another. The 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Marshall Garth, would establish the third side of the horseshoe. Infantry units would then sweep through the interior of the horseshoe, driving the enemy toward the waiting American forces. It was a hammer and anvil strategy. Classic military doctrine applied to counterinsurgency warfare, but warfare in Vietnam rarely went according to plan. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. The enemy was elusive, difficult to pin down, masters of disappearing into the jungle or melting away across the Cambodian border where American forces could not follow. Still, the Americans were determined to make this operation work. Firebase locations were carefully selected to support the sweeping infantry battalions. Artillery would be positioned to cover wide areas, ready to bring fire down on any enemy forces that were discovered. Helicopters would provide mobility, moving troops rapidly to where they were needed. Fighter bombers stood ready to deliver devastating airstrikes. Everything was planned, coordinated, rehearsed. And on this March morning, 2 American battalions were about to land in a clearing near the abandoned village of Suoi to establish one of those critical fire bases. They would call it Landing Zone Gold. Later, when it became a more permanent position, it would be redesignated Fire Support Base Gold. But most of the men who fought there would simply call it LZ Gold, or Firebase. Gold, the place where they nearly died. The place where they stood against an enemy determined to annihilate them. The soldiers boarding the Huey helicopters at Suoi Da, the staging area at the base of Black Virgin Mountain, were young. Most were 19 or 20 years old, drafted from small towns across America, trained for a few months at places like Fort Benning or Fort Polk, then shipped to Vietnam to fight in a war most of them didn't fully understand. Some had been in country for months and were combat veterans, their uniforms faded and stained, their faces lean and hard, their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much death. Others were new guys, fresh from the world as they called it, their uniforms still relatively clean, their boots not yet properly broken in, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and fear. Lieutenant Colonel John Bender commanded the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment. At 38 years old, he was a professional soldier, a West Point graduate who'd made the Army his career. Bender was known as a demanding but fair commander, someone who trained his men hard but also looked out for their welfare. He had arrived in Vietnam 6 months earlier and had already led his battalion through several operations in War Zone C. He knew the enemy they faced, knew the terrain, knew the risks. The 3rd of the 22nd Infantry had a proud lineage stretching back to the Civil War. They'd fought in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, in France during World War I, across the Pacific in World War II. Now they were fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, an environment completely different from anything their predecessors had faced. Dense vegetation that limited visibility to meters instead of kilometers. An enemy that didn't wear uniforms, that hid among the civilian population, that refused to stand and fight in conventional battles. booby traps and mines that killed and maimed indiscriminately. It was frustrating, dangerous warfare that tested soldiers in ways that traditional combat never had. Accompanying Bender's infantry was the 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery Regiment, 6 105mm howitzers that would provide fire support for operations throughout the region. The Artillery Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John William Vesey Jr., and Vesey was something special. A genuine American hero in an era when heroes were becoming harder to find. Vesey had lied about his age to join the Minnesota National Guard in 1939 when he was just 16 years old. Too young to drink, too young to vote, but old enough apparently to carry a rifle and serve his country. His unit, the 34th Infantry Division, had been activated for World War II, and Vesey had fought across North Africa and up through Italy. He'd been at Salerno when the Germans nearly drove the American invasion force back into the sea. He'd been at Anzio, that terrible beachhead, where American and British forces were pinned down for months under constant German artillery fire. At Anzio, Vesey had been a first sergeant, the senior enlisted man in his artillery battery, when German panzers broke through the Allied lines and charged toward the artillery positions. Most of the battery's officers had been killed or wounded. Vesey took command, rallied his men, ordered the howitzers depressed to zero elevation, and fired directly at the attacking tanks. The guns had roared, high explosive shells slamming into the German armor at point-blank range, and the attack had been broken. For his actions that day, Vesey received a battlefield commission to 2nd lieutenant, rising from the enlisted ranks to become an officer through demonstrated courage and leadership under fire. Now, 23 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Vesey was back in combat, older but no less capable, commanding an artillery battalion in a very different war. He'd spent the intervening years serving in Germany during the occupation, in Korea after that war, at various posts in the United States, steadily rising through the ranks. He'd earned a bachelor's degree through night school and correspondence courses, an impressive feat for someone who'd never finished high school before enlisting. He'd earned a master's degree in business administration. He'd attended the Command and General Staff College, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, all the schools that professional officers needed to advance. And through it all, he'd remained an artilleryman, someone who understood guns and fire support, and how to bring devastating firepower to bear on the enemy. The plan for March 19th seemed straightforward. The 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Mechanized, equipped with M113 armored personnel carriers, would push north from Suoi, securing the landing zone for the insertion of the infantry and artillery battalions. Once the LZ was secured, the helicopters would bring in the 3rd of the 22nd Infantry and the 2nd of the 77th Artillery. They'd dig in, establish defenses, set up the guns, and begin supporting search and destroy operations in the area. But the mechanized battalion ran into trouble almost immediately. They'd been pushing north through War Zone C when they started taking fire. Snipers in the trees, small ambushes, harassment fire from RPGs and recoilless rifles. Nothing they couldn't handle, but it slowed them down. By late afternoon on March 18th, they still hadn't reached the designated landing zone, and the brigade commander, Colonel Garth, made the decision to select an alternate LZ, closer to the mechanized battalion's position. Better to get the insertion done, even if it meant using a secondary location, than to delay the operation further. The new landing zone was located in an elliptical clearing near the abandoned village of Suoi. The clearing was about 300 meters by 400 meters, surrounded by sparse woodland. The trees had been hit with Agent Orange or some other defoliant during previous operations, leaving them skeletal and bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of dead men. It looked eerie, almost post-apocalyptic, but from a military standpoint, it offered good fields of fire. Enemy forces approaching across the clearing would be exposed, vulnerable to American weapons. What the Americans didn't know, what intelligence had failed to detect, was that the Viet Cong had been watching this area for weeks. They knew the Americans used this clearing as a landing zone. They'd seen helicopters land here during Operation Attleboro a few months earlier, and they'd prepared accordingly. Squads of VC sappers had moved through the area at night, planting improvised explosive devices throughout the clearing. 155mm artillery shells, unexploded ordnance that the VC had recovered from previous battles, or stolen from South Vietnamese forces, were buried in the ground with pressure plates on top. Step on the wrong spot, and 500 pounds of high explosive would detonate. Other shells were rigged with command detonation devices, wires running back to hidden positions in the tree line where VC soldiers waited with detonators in hand. The landing zone was a death trap, and the Americans were about to fly straight into it. The first lift of helicopters departed Suoi Da at 0800 hours on March 19th. 10 Hueys flying in tight formation, their turbine engines screaming, their rotor blades beating the humid air. Inside, each helicopter sat 11 soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder on the canvas seats, weapons held between their knees, faces showing the blank expression that soldiers adopt when heading into potential combat. Some men chewed gum, others smoked cigarettes. A few said prayers. Most just sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts, wondering what they'd find at the landing zone. The door gunners manned their M60s, scanning the jungle below as it rushed past. From altitude, Vietnam looked beautiful. Endless green forest, rivers snaking through the landscape, occasional villages with their neat rows of rice paddies. It was hard to believe a war was being fought down there, hard to reconcile the peaceful appearance with the reality of combat. The flight took about 15 minutes, the helicopters maintaining tight formation, flying low and fast to minimize exposure to enemy fire. As they approached the landing zone, the pilots started their descent, the Hueys dropping toward the clearing, their landing skids reaching down like the legs of giant insects. The first lift landed without incident. The helicopters touched down, and soldiers poured out, running to the edge of the clearing, establishing a hasty defensive perimeter. The pilots kept their engines running, ready to lift off immediately if they started, taking fire. But nothing happened. The landing zone was cold, as pilots called it. No enemy contact. The infantrymen spread out, weapons ready, but the tree line remained silent. The helicopters lifted off in a storm of dust and rotor wash, climbing back to altitude to return to Suoi Da for the second lift. So far, so good. The soldiers who'd just landed started moving through the clearing, checking for enemy positions, looking for any sign that the VC were in the area. They found nothing. The jungle was quiet, maybe too quiet. The second lift arrived 20 minutes later. 10 more Hueys descending toward the clearing, carrying another 110 soldiers. The lead helicopter was piloted by Warrant Officer James Mitchell, a 23-year-old from Tennessee who'd been flying Hueys in Vietnam for 8 months. Mitchell was a good pilot, smooth and confident, with over 500 combat flight hours under his belt. He'd been shot at dozens of times, taken hits from small arms fire, even survived a crash landing after his tail rotor was shot off by an RPG. Flying helicopters in Vietnam was one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, and Mitchell was good at it. As his Huey descended toward the landing zone, Mitchell saw the soldiers on the ground spread out in their defensive positions. Everything looked normal. He started his flare, pulling back on the cyclic to slow his descent, preparing to touch down. His skids were about 3 feet off the ground when the world exploded. The Viet Cong soldier hiding in the tree line pressed his detonator. The command wire ran across 200 meters of jungle floor to a buried 155mm artillery shell positioned directly beneath Mitchell's landing helicopter. 500 pounds of high explosive detonated with a thunderous blast, a geyser of dirt and fire erupting upward, engulfing the Huey. The helicopter disintegrated. There was no other word for it. The fuselage was torn apart by the blast, the tail boom severed, the rotor blades sheared off. Chunks of metal flew in every direction. Bodies were thrown from the wreckage, some already dead, others grievously wounded. Mitchell and his co-pilot died instantly, vaporized by the explosion. The crew chief and door gunner were killed. Of the 11 soldiers in the back, only 3 survived the initial blast, and all 3 were critically wounded, their bodies torn by shrapnel, bones broken, burns covering their skin. Before the debris from the first explosion had even finished falling, a second IED detonated beneath another helicopter, then a third. The VC had positioned multiple command-detonated explosives throughout the landing zone, and now they were triggering them as fast as they could, trying to destroy as many helicopters as possible. The clearing became a vision of hell. 3 helicopters were destroyed outright, reduced to burning wreckage in seconds. 5 more were damaged by shrapnel from the explosions, or from debris thrown by the blasts. Rotor blades were shredded, hydraulic lines were cut, fuel tanks were punctured. Pilots fought their controls, trying to keep their damaged birds airborne, trying to get away from the killing zone. One Huey, its tail rotor damaged by shrapnel, spun wildly as the pilot fought to maintain control. He managed to get the helicopter out of the landing zone, auto-rotating down to a hard landing about 200 meters away, the impact breaking the landing skids but leaving the crew and passengers alive. Another helicopter, its engine sputtering from debris ingestion, limped away trailing smoke, barely making it back to Suoi before the engine seized and quit. On the ground, chaos reigned. 8 soldiers were dead, their bodies scattered across the landing zone. 9 more were wounded, some horribly. Medics sprinted toward the casualties, ignoring the possibility of more IEDs, focused only on saving lives. They triaged quickly, separating those who might be saved from those who were beyond help, applying tourniquets, inserting IVs, calling desperately for medevac helicopters. The soldiers who'd landed in the first lift moved toward the tree line, weapons ready, expecting the IED attack to be followed by a ground assault. But no attack came. The jungle remained silent except for the crackling of burning helicopters and the screams of wounded men. The VC had sprung their trap and then melted away, leaving the Americans to deal with the casualties and destruction. But the insertion couldn't stop. There were more lifts scheduled, more soldiers and equipment to bring in. The firebase had to be established. Colonel Garth, monitoring the situation from his command helicopter, made the difficult decision to continue the operation. The landing zone would be swept for more IEDs. Engineers would be brought in, but the lifts would continue. Over the next several hours, the rest of the 3rd of the 22nd Infantry and the 2nd of the 77th Artillery were brought into Landing Zone Gold. Additional helicopters were damaged by mines and booby traps, but no more were destroyed. By late afternoon, both battalions were on the ground. The cost had been high: 14 men killed, 31 wounded, and 10 helicopters destroyed or heavily damaged. But they were down, and now the real work could begin. The first task was to establish a defensive perimeter. In Vietnam, you didn't just set up camp, you dug in. You dug fighting positions, bunkers, mortar pits, command posts, aid stations. You filled sandbags by the thousands. You strung concertina wire. You placed claymore mines and trip flares. You registered defensive artillery concentrations and established fields of fire for your machine guns. Building a firebase was backbreaking labor, and it had to be done quickly because the enemy could attack at any time. The infantrymen of the 3rd of the 22nd spread out around the perimeter of the clearing. Company A, commanded by Captain William Thompson, took the western side. Company B, under Captain Robert Hemphill, secured the eastern side. Company C remained at Suoi as brigade reserve. Each company established a sector, with platoons positioned to cover likely enemy approach routes. The soldiers dug their fighting positions first. In the red Vietnamese dirt, they excavated holes about 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 6 feet long. 2 men would occupy each position, one sleeping while the other pulled guard duty. The dirt they excavated was piled in front of the hole, creating a parapet that provided additional protection. Then came the sandbags, hundreds of them, filled with dirt and stacked around the fighting positions to create overhead cover and blast protection. The work was exhausting. The temperature climbed into the 90s. The humidity was near 100%. Sweat poured off the men in rivers. They drank water constantly, refilling their canteens from water cans that had been flown in, but they still felt perpetually thirsty. Digging in the hard-packed Vietnamese dirt under the tropical sun was like working in an oven, and there were no breaks, no time to rest. The firebase had to be ready before dark because night was when the enemy preferred to attack. Captain Robert Hemphill walked his sector of the perimeter, checking each position, making sure his company was properly deployed. Hemphill was 28 years old, a native of Alabama, an ROTC graduate who'd been commissioned 4 years earlier and had spent the last 2 years working his way up to company command. This was his first combat deployment, and he was determined to do everything right, to take care of his men, to maintain the standards he'd been taught at the Infantry Officer Basic Course and Ranger School. His soldiers were a mix of draftees and volunteers, enlisted men and junior NCOs, most of them in their late teens or early 20s. They came from every part of America. cities and farms, north and south, rich and poor. The draft didn't discriminate much in those days, though college students could get deferments, meaning the working-class kids bore a disproportionate share of the burden. But regardless of their backgrounds, they were all soldiers now, all members of Company B, 3rd of the 22nd Infantry, and they'd fight for each other when the time came. Private First Class David Wilson was typical of the men in the company. 20 years old, from a small town in Ohio, drafted 6 months after graduating high school. He'd worked in his father's hardware store, planned to maybe go to community college eventually, maybe learn a trade. Then his draft notice arrived. 2 months of basic training at Fort Benning. Another 2 months of advanced individual training. Then Vietnam. He'd been in country for 3 months now, long enough to lose his newbie status, but not long enough to feel like a veteran. He'd been in a few firefights, short engagements with small enemy forces, but nothing major. Nothing like what some of the older guys talked about. The battles from Operation Attleboro or Cedar Falls where hundreds of VC attacked and the fighting went on for hours. Wilson shared his fighting position with Specialist 4 Robert Martinez, a 21-year-old from Texas who was on his second tour in Vietnam. Martinez was a machine gunner, responsible for the M60 that was the backbone of their squad's firepower. He'd been wounded during his first tour, shrapnel in his leg from a mortar round, medevats to Japan, then returned to duty and volunteered to come back to Vietnam. When Wilson asked him why he'd volunteered to return, Martinez had shrugged and said, "My buddies are over here, couldn't leave them." It was a common sentiment. Many soldiers extended their tours or volunteered for additional deployments not out of patriotism or belief in the war's aims, but simply because they felt obligated to the men they served with. The two men worked together to improve their position. They dug it deeper, stacked sandbags higher, cleared fields of fire to their front. Martinez set up his M60 on its bipod, laying it so it covered a likely enemy approach route from the tree line. Wilson positioned bandoliers of ammunition within easy reach. They placed grenades in a small pit they had dug next to their position. They marked likely target reference points, spots in their sector where enemy soldiers might appear, so they could engage quickly without having to search for targets. Nearby, Sergeant First Class William Henderson, a squad leader, moved from position to position, checking on his men, offering advice, making small corrections. Henderson was 30 years old, a career soldier who'd been in the Army for 12 years. He'd served in Korea after the war, in Germany during the Cold War, and now in Vietnam. He was a professional, someone who knew infantry tactics inside and out, someone his men respected and trusted. Henderson had a wife and 2 kids back at Fort Lewis, Washington, and he carried their picture in his wallet, looked at it every night before going to sleep. 312 days left on his tour. He counted them obsessively, marking each day off on his short-timer calendar, dreaming of the day he'd rotate back to the world and be reunited with his family. "Make sure you've got good drainage," Henderson told Wilson and Martinez. "We get a rain tonight, and these holes will fill up with water if you don't dig a sump." The 2 soldiers dug a deeper hole in one corner of their fighting position, a sump that would collect water and keep the main fighting area relatively dry. It was one of those small pieces of infantry wisdom that separated veterans from newbies, the kind of knowledge that came from experience and got passed down from senior soldiers to junior ones. While the infantry dug in, the artillery battalion was establishing its own. Positions inside the perimeter. The 6 155mm howitzers were positioned in a rough circle, each gun with its trail dug into the ground, its aiming stakes set, its ammunition stacked nearby. Each howitzer had a crew of 7 men, a chief of section who commanded the gun, a gunner who aimed it, an assistant gunner who set fuses, 4 cannoneers who loaded and fired. These crews had trained together for months, had worked together until they could service their guns almost by instinct, each man knowing his job so well that he could do it in the dark or under fire without even thinking about it. The howitzers themselves were formidable weapons. The M1, O1, A1, 105mm howitzer had been the backbone of American artillery since World War II. It fired a 33-pound projectile out to 11,000 meters, over 6 miles, with good accuracy. It could fire high explosive rounds to destroy enemy positions, illumination rounds to light up the battlefield at night, smoke rounds to obscure movement, and a variety of specialized munitions for specific situations. One of those specialized munitions was about to prove critical. The M546 Apers T round, more commonly known as the beehive round, was a relatively new addition to the Army's arsenal. First fired in combat in 1966, just a year earlier, the beehive round was designed specifically to deal with massed infantry attacks. Instead of a single large projectile, the round contained 8,000 steel flechettes, each 1.5 inches long, fin-stabilized, designed to fly straight and true. When fired, a mechanical time fuse would detonate a small bursting charge that opened the shell and released the flechettes in a cone-shaped pattern. The effect was like a giant shotgun, thousands of steel darts spreading out to cover a wide area, shredding anything in their path. Each artillery position at Firebase Gold had beehive rounds stacked and ready, marked with distinctive yellow bands so they could be identified quickly. The crews had trained on firing beehive rounds, understood the special procedures required. When firing beehive, you had to warn friendly forces because the flechettes could cause casualties to anyone in front of the gun. Green Star clusters would be fired into the air before each beehive mission, signaling everyone to get down and stay down. Lieutenant Colonel Vesey moved from gun position to position, checking on his crews, ensuring everything was properly set up. He inspected ammunition stacks, verified that defensive concentrations had been registered, made sure each gun crew understood their sectors of responsibility. Vesey was a hands-on commander, someone who believed in leading from the front, someone who wanted to see things for himself, rather than relying solely on reports from subordinates. As evening fell on March 19th, Firebase Gold was taking shape. The perimeter was established, if not quite complete. The artillery was ready to fire. The command post was operational, radios crackling with traffic as units reported their status. The aid station was set up, medical supplies organized, ready to receive casualties. Supply helicopters had brought in ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies. Everything a firebase needed to function, but something felt wrong. The veterans sensed it, that indefinable feeling that combat soldiers develop. A sixth sense that warns of danger. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no monkeys, nothing. Just oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the firebase like a physical weight. When the jungle went quiet, it usually meant the enemy was near, that something was about to happen. As darkness fell, the men of Firebase Gold settled into their positions. Half the force would be awake at all times, maintaining 50% security throughout the night. The other half would try to sleep, though few would actually manage it. The veterans knew better than to sleep soundly in War Zone C. The new guys were too nervous, their adrenaline too high, their imaginations too active. Company B sent out a night patrol, a squad-sized element led by Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a 24-year-old from Boston who was on his second tour in Vietnam. O'Brien had 9 men with him, enough to fight if they encountered a small enemy force, small enough to move quietly through the jungle. Their mission was to set up an ambush position about 500 meters outside the perimeter to serve as an early warning system in case the enemy tried to approach during the night. The patrol slipped through a gap in the wire just after dark and melted into the jungle. They moved slowly, carefully, using the trails that crisscrossed the area, but staying off them, moving parallel to them instead, ready to ambush any enemy forces using the trails to approach the firebase. After 45 minutes of careful movement, O'Brien selected an ambush site, a spot where the trail bent around a large tree, forcing anyone using the trail to pass within a few meters of the patrol's position. The men established a linear ambush, spreading out along one side of the trail, each man in a concealed position with a good view of the kill zone. They laid out claymore mines covering the trail, the command detonators held by O'Brien and his assistant patrol leader. Then they settled in to wait, weapons ready, knowing that the next several hours would be spent in absolute silence, not moving, barely breathing, watching and listening for any sign of the enemy. Back at the firebase, the rest of the battalion tried to rest. Some men wrote letters home by flashlight, carefully shielding the light so it wouldn't be visible from outside the perimeter. Others cleaned their weapons, disassembling their M16s, wiping down each part, oiling the bolt carrier, reassembling everything, checking function. Weapons maintenance was constant in Vietnam. The jungle environment, the dust, the humidity, the river crossings, all combined to make weapons malfunction if they weren't properly maintained. Soldiers learned to clean their weapons obsessively, understanding that their lives might depend on their rifle working when they needed it. The artillery crews ran through their procedures one more time. Beehive rounds were brought up and positioned for easy access. Fuses were checked, aiming stakes were verified. Everything had to be perfect, because if they were attacked, there would be no time for second chances, no opportunity to correct mistakes. March 20th dawned hot and humid, like every day in this part of Vietnam. The men who'd been on perimeter guard during the night were relieved, stumbling back to their positions to grab a few hours of sleep. Those who'd been sleeping took over the watch, checking their sectors, scanning the tree line through binoculars, looking for any sign of enemy activity. The night patrol came back in, O'Brien and his men exhausted, their uniforms soaked with sweat despite the relatively cool night temperatures. They'd seen nothing, heard nothing, spent 8 hours in the jungle watching an empty trail. It was typical of patrols in Vietnam, long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. This had been one of the boring ones, and everyone was grateful for that. The day was spent improving the Firebase defenses. More wire was strung, creating multiple barriers around the perimeter. Engineers used bulldozers to clear fields of fire, pushing down the dead trees that had been defoliated, creating open ground that attackers would have to cross. Claymore mines were emplaced every 10 meters around the perimeter, each one positioned to cover an approach route, each one wired back to a fighting position, where a defender could detonate it when enemy soldiers entered the kill zone. Additional units arrived during the day. The 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joe Elliott, landed at Firebase Gold and then moved out to the northwest on a search and destroy mission. Their departure reduced the Firebase's garrison back to about 450 men, but Colonel Garth believed the enemy had been driven away by Operation Junction City's operations, that the area was relatively secure. Intelligence reports suggested no major enemy forces were in the immediate vicinity. The Firebase should be safe. Intelligence was wrong, catastrophically wrong. About 3 kilometers away, hidden in the jungle, the commander of the Viet Cong's 272nd Regiment was finalizing his plans. The regiment had been watching the Americans since they'd landed. VC scouts had counted the helicopters, estimated the American strength, identified the locations of the command posts and artillery positions. The regimental commander, a veteran of the war against the French and now the Americans, saw an opportunity. The Americans had established a fire base deep in War Zone C, far from immediate reinforcement, garrisoned by less than 500 men. If he could mass his entire regiment, plus 2 additional battalions that had been attached to him for this operation, he could attack with overwhelming force. He could overrun the firebase, kill or capture hundreds of Americans, seize their artillery and weapons, and inflict the kind of defeat that would make headlines around the world. The 272nd Regiment was an experienced, capable force. They'd fought in dozens of battles, had inflicted heavy casualties on South Vietnamese and American units. They knew how to move through the jungle without being detected, how to mass for attack, how to use terrain and darkness to their advantage. They were well armed with AK-47 rifles, RPD and RPK machine guns, RPG-7 rocket launchers, 60mm and 82mm mortars, even some captured American M79 grenade launchers and M60s. They had satchel charges for destroying bunkers, Bangalore torpedoes for breaching wire obstacles, and the fanatical determination that came from fighting for what they believed was the liberation of their country from foreign occupation. Throughout March 20th, the 272nd Regiment moved into position. Small groups of soldiers, never more than a squad or 2 at a time, infiltrated through the jungle, approaching to within a few hundred meters of Firebase Gold. They moved so quietly, so carefully, that American patrols and observation posts never detected them. They hid in the dense vegetation during the day, concealed by the jungle canopy from American aircraft flying overhead. They dug shallow scrapes in the ground, covered themselves with vegetation, and waited for nightfall. As darkness fell on March 20th, the VC began their final preparations. Mortar crews carried their heavy tubes forward, positioning them in pre-selected locations that offered good lines of fire to the American fire base. Each mortar position was carefully scouted, the distances measured, the firing data calculated. The mortarmen stacked their ammunition, dozens of rounds per tube, enough to sustain a bombardment for 10 or 15 minutes. The mortar crews were good, experienced, had fired countless missions against American and South Vietnamese positions. They knew how to register their targets, how to walk their fire across enemy positions, how to maximize casualties. Assault battalions moved into their assembly areas, the soldiers checking their weapons, fixing bayonets, preparing for the attack. Squad leaders gave last-minute instructions. Company commanders synchronized watches, verified timing, confirmed that everyone understood the plan. The regiment would attack from 3 directions simultaneously, from the north, east, and south, hitting the Americans from multiple directions at once, preventing them from concentrating their defense. Sappers would breach the wire. Assault troops would pour through the gaps. Mortar fire would suppress the Americans during the critical first minutes of the attack. On paper, it was a good plan. The 272nd had over 2,500 men committed to the attack. They had surprise, careful planning, good intelligence about the American positions. They had weapons and ammunition. They had determination and courage. By all calculations, they should be able to overrun Firebase Gold before American reinforcements could arrive, before American artillery from other fire bases could bring effective fire to bear, before American air power could be brought into the fight. But warfare is never just about numbers and plans. It's about the men who do the fighting, about leadership under fire, about weapons and tactics and luck. And the Americans at Firebase Gold, though outnumbered 5-1, had advantages the VC commander hadn't fully appreciated. They had professional soldiers and competent leaders. They had artillery inside their own perimeter that could deliver devastating firepower at point-blank range. They had those beehive rounds, weapons the VC had never faced before. And they had the stubborn courage that American soldiers have shown in every war, the refusal to quit even when the situation seems hopeless. That afternoon, Colonel Garth flew over the area in his small observation helicopter, conducting an aerial reconnaissance. He was looking for signs of enemy activity, checking terrain, ensuring he understood the situation on the ground. As his helicopter circled about 1,500 feet above Firebase Gold, Garth suddenly spotted movement in the jungle to the southwest. He grabbed his binoculars, focused on the spot, and felt his blood run cold. 30 to 35 Viet Cong soldiers moving in formation through the trees, heading generally toward the firebase. Garth immediately radioed Lieutenant Colonel Bender and Lieutenant Colonel Vesey, alerting them to the enemy sighting. Both battalion commanders acknowledged and began making preparations. The firebase went on full alert. Perimeter guards were reinforced. Artillery registered fire missions on the enemy location. Fighter bombers were called in. F-4 Phantoms screaming down to drop bombs and napalm on the tree line where the enemy had been spotted. But after the airstrikes, there was no way to determine if any enemy had been killed. The jungle swallowed the smoke and flames, and when it cleared, there was nothing to see. The VC had either been killed, wounded, and evacuated, or had simply moved to a different location. Garth couldn't know which. All he knew was that the enemy was out there, close to the firebase, probably planning something. He issued orders for increased vigilance. Additional patrols would be sent out during the night. Defensive concentrations would be fired periodically to discourage enemy movement. Illumination rounds would be used to light up the perimeter at irregular intervals. Everyone needed to stay alert, stay ready. An attack was possible, perhaps even likely. As night fell on March 20th, the atmosphere at Firebase Gold was tense. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know when or from where. The men checked their weapons again, making sure magazines were fully loaded, that grenades were within reach, that machine gun belts were properly linked. Officers and NCOs moved along the perimeter, offering words of encouragement, checking fighting positions, making sure everyone knew what to do if they were attacked. The artillery crews prepared for rapid-fire missions. Additional ammunition was brought up to each gun position. Powder charges were prepared, fuses were set. Everything was ready so that, when the call came, they could respond instantly. Captain Hemphill gathered his platoon leaders for a final briefing. "If they hit us tonight," he said, "they'll probably come from multiple directions at once. Don't get fixated on the fighting in one sector. Watch your assigned area. Maintain your fields of fire. Use your claymores when you've got good targets. Conserve your ammo. Aim your shots. We've got artillery and air support available, So if we can hold them off for a few minutes, we can bring a lot of firepower down on them." The platoon leaders nodded, taking in the information, mentally rehearsing what they'd need to do. First Lieutenant James Carroll, leading 1st Platoon, asked about the withdrawal plan if the position became untenable. Hemphill shook his head. "There is no withdrawal plan. We hold this position. Period. If they breach the perimeter, we fall back to secondary positions inside the firebase. But we do not abandon Firebase Gold. Clear?" "Clear, sir," Carroll replied. He understood. In Vietnam, abandoning a firebase meant leaving artillery and heavy weapons for the enemy to capture. It meant admitting defeat. It meant casualties for nothing. They would hold or die trying. Company B sent out another patrol that night, Sergeant O'Brien and his squad moving into the darkness once again. They took a different route this time, moving to the east instead of the north, setting up an ambush position along a different trail. The procedure was the same: move quietly, avoid detection, set up claymores, wait and watch. It was dangerous, nerve-wracking work. The patrol was isolated, separated from the firebase by 500 meters of jungle. If they were discovered and attacked by a large enemy force, they'd be wiped out before help could arrive. But that was the job. Early warning was critical. If the patrol could detect enemy movement and report it, even if they were killed doing so, they'd give the firebase precious minutes to prepare. The night passed slowly. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The normal jungle noises, insects and night birds, and the rustle of wind through trees took on sinister overtones. Soldiers strained their eyes, staring into the blackness beyond the perimeter, seeing shapes that weren't there, imagining enemy soldiers creeping forward. Illumination rounds were fired periodically, the magnesium flares floating down on parachutes, casting harsh shadows, turning the jungle into a surreal landscape of light and dark. But they revealed nothing. No enemy, no movement, just empty jungle. At 0430 hours on March 21st, O'Brien's patrol, positioned 500 meters outside the firebase perimeter, heard something. Voices, distant, speaking Vietnamese. Then the sound of movement, many people moving through the jungle, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. The rustle of equipment, the snap of a twig, the whisper of fabric against vegetation. O'Brien keyed his radio handset, whispering into the microphone. Contact, enemy movement, multiple personnel, moving toward firebase. He gave his location, estimated the enemy strength as best he could in the darkness. At least a company, maybe more. They were moving in formation, using the trails, heading directly toward Firebase Gold. At the firebase, the radio operator at the battalion command post acknowledged O'Brien's report and immediately alerted Lieutenant Colonel Bender and Captain Hemphill. The word spread quickly along the perimeter. Enemy approaching. Unknown strength. Multiple personnel. This might be it. O'Brien and his men waited, hoping the enemy would pass by their position, would continue toward the firebase without detecting the patrol. But luck wasn't with them. A VC soldier moving along the trail spotted something, a shape that didn't look quite right, perhaps a reflection off a weapon barrel. He stopped, whispered to his comrades, pointed toward the American position. O'Brien knew they'd been compromised. He detonated his claymores. The mines exploded with sharp cracks, thousands of steel balls tearing through the VC soldiers on the trail. Men screamed, bodies fell. But there were too many of them. The enemy assault force, far larger than a single company, at least 200 men, maybe more, immediately opened fire on the patrol's position. AK-47s crackled, RPD machine guns hammered, grenades exploded. The patrol returned fire, their M16s and M79s trying to hold back the enemy tide, but they were outnumbered 20-1. O'Brien radioed again, his voice urgent. "Contact! Heavy contact! We're being overrun." Then his radio went dead. The patrol fought for 5 minutes, maybe less. They killed dozens of VC, the claymores, and concentrated fire from 9 M16s, creating a storm of lead that cut down the enemy soldiers at close range. But there were always more. The VC surged forward, throwing grenades, firing from multiple directions, overwhelming the small American force through sheer numbers. Every man in that patrol died or was critically wounded. Not a single soldier made it back to the firebase. They'd given their lives to provide a few minutes of warning, to alert their comrades that the enemy was coming. It was a sacrifice that would save dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives in the Firebase, though the patrol members would never know it. At Firebase Gold, everyone was now fully awake, fully alert. The sound of the firefight to the east, the patrol's frantic radio call, made it clear that something big was about to happen. Men checked their weapons one more time. Machine gunners test-fired a short burst to make sure their guns were working. Soldiers positioned themselves in their fighting holes, fingers on triggers, eyes scanning the darkness. The clock ticked toward 0630. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the first gray light of dawn filtering through the jungle. Soldiers called it BMNT, Begin Morning Nautical Twilight, that period before sunrise when there's enough light to see but not enough to see clearly, when everything is shadows and shapes, when friend and enemy are hard to distinguish. At 0631 hours, exactly on schedule, the VC attack began. The first mortar rounds came without warning. No preliminary bombardment, no ranging shots. The VC mortar crews had registered their targets perfectly during their careful preparation, had calculated the exact firing data needed to hit specific points within Firebase Gold. Now, at the signal, every mortar tube in the 272nd Regiment opened fire simultaneously. Over 24 mortars, 60mm and 82mm tubes began firing as fast as their crews could load them. The heavy 82mm rounds each weighed nearly 7 pounds and could kill or wound anyone within a 25-meter radius. The lighter 60mm rounds had a smaller kill radius, but could be fired faster, up to 30 rounds per minute by an experienced crew. The mortars walked across Firebase Gold in a carefully orchestrated pattern. The first rounds hit the northern sector of the perimeter, where Company B's 1st platoon was positioned. High explosive rounds detonated with sharp cracks, sending shrapnel buzzing through the air like a swarm of angry bees. Soldiers dove for cover, pressing themselves into the bottom of their fighting holes, curling up to present the smallest possible target. Private David Wilson heard the first mortars coming in, that distinctive whistle-whoosh sound that every combat soldier learns to recognize and fear. He yelled, "Incoming!" and dropped to the floor of his fighting position, covering his head with his arms. Specialist Martinez dropped beside him. Both men pressed against the dirt as the world exploded around them. The mortar round hit 10 meters away, the blast wave washing over their position, dirt and shrapnel peppering their sandbags. Another round hit closer, maybe 5 meters. Then another. The VC were walking their fire across the perimeter, trying to destroy as many positions as possible, trying to kill the defenders before the ground assault even began. Along the entire perimeter, all mortar rounds fell like rain, 500 rounds in the first 10 minutes. That's nearly 1 round per second, a rate of fire that was almost incomprehensible. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of explosions that made communication impossible. Men could only crouch in their holes and pray that the next round wouldn't land directly on them. Several fighting positions took direct hits. A mortar round fell directly into one hole, killing both soldiers instantly. Another hit near a machine gun position, the shrapnel killing the gunner and wounding his assistant. A third landed near the battalion aid station, wounding 2 medics and several soldiers who'd been waiting for treatment of minor injuries. The artillery positions took heavy fire as well. The VC had identified the locations of all 6 howitzers, and mortar rounds fell among the gun crews with devastating accuracy. One round hit directly on a howitzer, destroying the weapon's recoil mechanism and blowing the trail apart. The gun crew scrambled away from the damaged weapon, taking cover behind nearby sandbags. Another round fell among a stack of ammunition, but miraculously the propellant charges didn't detonate, and after a few seconds of heart-stopping terror, the crew realized they were still alive. Lieutenant Colonel Vesey sprinted from his sleeping bunker toward the artillery positions, mortar rounds exploding around him, shrapnel whistling past his head. A piece of hot metal tore through his uniform sleeve, but didn't draw blood. He reached the first gun position and began shouting orders over the roar of explosions. "Get those guns firing. Defensive concentrations. Fire everything you've got." The gun crews, trained and disciplined despite the chaos, began servicing their weapons. Damaged guns were assessed. Could they be fixed? Could they still fire? One gun had its sights destroyed, but the crew could still lay the tube by using aiming stakes and the gun's direct fire optics. Another had its trail damaged, but it could still fire if they wedged sandbags under it to keep it stable. Of the 6 guns, 3 were seriously damaged, but might be repairable. The other 3 were still functional, and Vesey ordered them into action immediately. But before the artillery could fire, the ground assault began. Through the smoke and dust from the mortar bombardment, figures emerged from the tree line, hundreds of them, then 1,000, then more. The Viet Cong were attacking in human waves, entire companies advancing in line abreast. Soldiers running across the open ground toward the American perimeter, firing as they came, screaming battle cries that chilled the blood of the defenders. They came from 3 directions simultaneously. From the north, at least a battalion, 500 men, charging toward Company B's positions. From the east, another battalion, hitting the junction between Company B and Company A. From the south, a 3rd battalion, striking at Company A's sector. The VC regimental commander had positioned his forces perfectly, had coordinated the assault so that the Americans would be hit from multiple directions at once, forcing them to divide their defensive fire, preventing them from concentrating their forces. The American defenders opened fire. M60s hammered from bunkers around the perimeter, their tracer rounds arcing out toward the attacking formations. Every 5th round, a tracer that glowed red in the dim morning light. M16s crackled on semi-automatic and full automatic, soldiers firing as fast as they could aim and pull the trigger. M79 grenade launchers thumped, their 40mm rounds tumbling toward enemy formations, detonating with sharp cracks that killed or wounded anyone within 5 meters of the explosion. The claymore mines were detonated. Squad leaders and fire team leaders pressing the clackers when they saw enemy soldiers entering the kill zones. The mines exploded with sharp reports, each one releasing 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc, shredding everything in their path. The effect was devastating. Entire groups of VC soldiers were cut down by single claymore detonations, bodies falling like wheat before a scythe. But still they came. For every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more stepped over his body and kept advancing. The VC had committed everything to this attack, had accepted that casualties would be high, had calculated that if they could just reach the American wire, if they could just breach the perimeter, the close quarters fighting that followed would neutralize American firepower advantages. Private Wilson fired his M16 on semi-automatic, taking aimed shots at the advancing soldiers. Fire. Shift aim. Fire again. Each shot dropped an enemy soldier, his spent brass casings piled up at the bottom of his fighting hole. Beside him, Martinez was firing his M60 in short bursts, 3 to 5 round bursts, conserving ammunition but maintaining a high rate of fire. The machine gun's barrel began to glow red from the heat, and Martinez poured water from his canteen over it to cool it down, steam hissing as the water hit the hot metal. A group of VC soldiers broke through the wire on the northern sector, Bangalore torpedoes having blown a gap through the concertina. The enemy poured through the breach, firing as they came, throwing grenades, charging toward the American positions. Sergeant Henderson, leading his squad, organized a counterattack. He gathered 5 men, gave quick instructions, then led them forward, moving from cover to cover, engaging the enemy at close range. Henderson fired his M16, killing 2 VC soldiers. One of his men, Specialist Robert Green, threw a grenade that landed among a group of enemy soldiers, the explosion killing 3 and wounding 2 more. They fought their way toward the breach, trying to seal it, trying to prevent more enemy from getting inside the perimeter. Then, Henderson went down, hit by a burst from an AK-47, 3 rounds stitching across his chest. He fell hard, his rifle clattering away. Green sprinted forward, grabbed Henderson under the arms, and dragged him back toward cover, bullets kicking up dirt around them. They made it to a bunker, and Green laid Henderson down, checking for a pulse. The sergeant was still alive, barely, blood bubbling from his chest wounds. Green called for a medic, but he knew it was bad, knew Henderson probably wouldn't make it. All around the perimeter, similar scenes played out. Small groups of American soldiers fought desperate actions against larger enemy forces. Squad leaders led counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed and warped. Riflemen engaged targets at point-blank range. And still the enemy came, wave after wave, seemingly endless. By 0700 hours, just 30 minutes into the attack, the situation was critical. The VC had breached the perimeter in 3 places. American casualties were mounting. Ammunition was running low. The artillery positions were under direct fire from enemy soldiers who'd gotten inside the wire. The battalion command post was in danger of being overrun. This was the moment when Firebase Gold nearly fell. The balance hung by a thread. If the VC could push just a little harder, if they could overrun the artillery positions, the battle would be over. But the Americans refused to break. Despite the casualties, despite the overwhelming enemy numbers, despite the desperate situation, they held on. And then Lieutenant Colonel Vesey's artillery crews prepared to deliver the weapon that would turn the battle. Lieutenant Colonel Vesey moved along the gun line, bullets snapping past his head, mortar rounds still falling around him. He reached the first functional howitzer, where Sergeant First Class Donald Mitchell and his crew were preparing to fire. Mitchell was a 28-year-old artillery NCO from Georgia, a professional soldier who'd been firing guns for 10 years. He'd never fired a beehive round in combat before, but he'd trained on them, knew the procedures, understood their devastating potential. "Beehive!" Vesey shouted over the noise of battle. "Fire beehive rounds directly at the enemy. 0 elevation, point-blank range." Mitchell acknowledged and immediately began issuing orders to his crew. The assistant gunner grabbed a beehive round, easily identified by its yellow markings, and loaded it into the breech. The round was different from a standard high explosive shell. Instead of explosive filler, it contained 8,000 steel flechettes packed in sawdust, held in place by a thin aluminum casing. A mechanical time fuse in the nose of the round could be set for any distance from muzzle action all the way out to several thousand meters. For this mission, Mitchell set the fuse for muzzle action. That meant the round would open the instant it left the barrel, releasing all 8,000 flechettes in a cone-shaped pattern that would spread out as they flew downrange. At 50 meters, the pattern would be about 30 meters wide. At 100 meters, it would be 60 meters wide. The flechettes would fly at nearly 3,000 feet per second, supersonic, each one 1.5 inch long steel dart with fins that kept it flying straight and true. The physics of the beehive round were brutal. Each flechette weighed about 8 grains, roughly half a gram. It wasn't particularly heavy, but at supersonic speed, it carried enormous kinetic energy. The flechettes were designed to tumble when they hit flesh, creating wounds far larger than their size would suggest. A single flechette could pass completely through a human body, often striking multiple people if they were in line. The fins caused the darts to make a distinctive buzzing sound as they flew through the air, which is how the round got its nickname. Soldiers who heard that sound never forgot it. Mitchell's crew trained their howitzer on the northern sector, where the enemy had breached the perimeter. The gun was aimed directly at a mass of VC soldiers, maybe 50 or 60 men, who were advancing toward the artillery positions. The range was less than 100 meters. At this range, with beehive, the effect would be apocalyptic. Before firing, green star clusters were shot into the air, the signal for all friendly forces to get down. American soldiers saw the green flares and dropped, pressing themselves into the bottoms of their fighting holes, covering their heads. You didn't want to be in front of a beehive round when it fired, even if you were on the same side. The flechettes didn't discriminate between friend and enemy. They killed everything in their path. Mitchell made one final check of his gun's alignment, then gave the order. "Fire!" The howitzer roared. The 1.5mm gun tube jumped, even with its trail dug into the ground. A tongue of flame shot from the muzzle. The beehive round flew downrange for maybe 1/10 of a second before the mechanical fuse functioned. The thin aluminum casing split open, and 8,000 flechettes burst forth in a spreading cone of death. The effect on the attacking VC soldiers was indescribable. One moment they were advancing, firing their weapons, shouting battle cries. The next moment, the entire formation simply disintegrated. Bodies were shredded. Men fell by the dozens, torn apart by thousands of supersonic steel darts. The flechettes passed through multiple soldiers, through light cover, through trees and vegetation. Nothing stopped them. Nothing could stop them. It was like a giant invisible scythe had swept through the enemy formation, cutting down everything in its path. The few VC soldiers who survived the blast were in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their entire company had been advancing together. And then suddenly everyone around them was dead or dying, their bodies torn by wounds they'd never seen before, small puncture wounds that bled profusely, that had caused massive internal damage. Mitchell's crew was already reloading. Another beehive round was rammed into the breach. The gun was relayed on a new target, another mass of enemy soldiers trying to push through the wire. The crew fired again. Another 8,000 flechettes screamed downrange. Another enemy formation was destroyed. At the other functional howitzers, other crews were doing the same thing. Gun after gun firing beehive rounds at point-blank range, each shot destroying dozens of enemy soldiers, turning the human wave attacks into a slaughterhouse. The VC had never faced this weapon before. They had no tactics to counter it, no way to protect themselves. All they could do was keep attacking, keep moving forward, and keep dying. Private Wilson, still in his fighting position on the northern perimeter, watched in awe as the beehive rounds tore through the enemy formations. He'd heard about these rounds, had seen them demonstrated during training, but seeing them used in combat was something else entirely. The enemy soldiers just fell, dozens at a time, their bodies suddenly riddled with puncture wounds. It was horrifying and effective in equal measure. "Jesus Christ," Martinez whispered beside him, his M60 momentarily silent as he stared at the carnage the beehive rounds were creating. "That's the most terrible thing I've ever seen." It was terrible. The beehive rounds killed with an efficiency that was almost industrial, each shot destroying an area the size of a basketball court. Everything living in that area simply ceasing to exist. But it was also saving their lives. Before the beehive rounds started firing, the VC had been on the verge of overrunning the Firebase. Now, their attack was stalling, entire companies being wiped out before they could reach the American positions. Vesey moved from gun to gun, directing fire, ensuring the crews were targeting the most dangerous threats. He spotted a group of VC soldiers trying to flank one of the artillery positions, moving through a small depression that gave them some cover. He ordered one of the howitzers to train on that position and fire. The gun crew complied, loading a beehive round, aiming carefully, firing. The round detonated over the depression, the flechettes raining down from above, killing everyone in the low ground. A VC soldier armed with an RPG launcher appeared at the tree line, taking aim at one of the howitzers. Vesey saw him, grabbed an M79 grenade launcher from a nearby soldier, aimed, and fired. The 40mm grenade hit the RPG gunner square in the chest, exploding on impact, killing him instantly. Vesey handed the grenade launcher back and continued moving along the gun line. During one lull in the firing, an enemy tracer round struck a 55-gallon drum of diesel fuel positioned near one of the artillery pieces. The drum exploded into flames, burning fuel spreading across the ground. Nearby were two more drums, but these contained explosives, powder charges for the artillery. If the fire reached those drums, the resulting explosion would kill everyone in the area and probably destroy the howitzer. Vesey didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the burning fuel, the heat so intense it singed his eyebrows and the hair on his arms. He grabbed the first drum of explosives and rolled it away from the flames, his hands burning on the hot metal. Then he went back for the second drum, ignoring the pain, ignoring the danger, dragging it to safety as ammunition started cooking off from the heat, bullets snapping through the air around him. His actions saved the gun and its crew, but he'd been burned in the process, his hands blistered and raw. Vesey ignored the pain. There would be time to treat wounds later. Right now, they had a battle to win. By 0730 hours, the beehive rounds had broken the back of the first major assault. The VC had taken horrific casualties, hundreds of dead littering the ground around the perimeter. But the attack wasn't over. The enemy regimental commander still had reserves, fresh troops who hadn't yet been committed to the fight. He ordered them forward, determined to break through, determined to overrun the Firebase no matter the cost. The second wave came from the east, hitting Company B's positions with renewed fury. But this time, the American defenders were ready. The beehive rounds continued to fire, each shot destroying enemy formations. The infantry added their fire, M60s hammering, M16s cracking, grenades flying. The combination of beehive artillery and concentrated small arms fire created a killing zone that no enemy force could penetrate. Captain Hemphill, coordinating the defense of his company's sector, called in the locations of enemy formations to the Artillery Fire Direction Center. The FDC would calculate firing data and relay it to the guns, which would engage within seconds. It was a well-oiled system, developed through training and now perfected in combat. American artillery had always been good, but here at Firebase Gold, with beehive rounds fired at point-blank range, it was achieving a level of effectiveness that was almost unbelievable. The artillery crews were exhausted, wounded, running on adrenaline. The gun chiefs were shouting corrections. The gunners were making fine adjustments. The cannoneers were loading rounds as fast as their arms could move. The ammunition stacks were dwindling rapidly. Each gun was firing dozens of rounds, the brass powder charge casings piling up around the positions. The gun barrels were so hot, they glowed red, and crews poured water over them to cool them down between fire missions. Sergeant Mitchell's crew had been firing continuously for over an hour. They'd fired 30 beehive rounds and probably 20 high explosive rounds. Mitchell's ears were ringing from the concussion of those gun firing. His voice was hoarse from shouting commands. His uniform was soaked with sweat and blood from minor shrapnel wounds he didn't even remember receiving. But his gun kept firing. As long as they had ammunition and the gun stayed functional, they would keep firing. One of the damaged howitzers was returned to service through the desperate efforts of its crew. The gun's recoil mechanism had been damaged by mortar fire, and normally it would take hours to repair in a maintenance facility with proper tools. But Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez and his crew jury-rigged a fix using rope, sandbags, and sheer determination. They couldn't repair the recoil mechanism properly, so they immobilized the gun, wedging it in place with sandbags so it couldn't recoil when it fired. The gun could only fire directly forward now, couldn't be traversed or elevated much, but it could fire. And every gun that could fire might mean the difference between victory and defeat. Rodriguez's crew brought the gun back into action, loading a beehive round, aiming at a group of VC soldiers who were massing for another assault. They fired. The gun jumped violently, the improvised immobilization system barely holding, but the round went downrange and detonated perfectly, the flechettes cutting down the enemy formation. The crew reloaded and fired again, and again, until their makeshift repair finally failed and the gun went out of action for good. But they'd gotten off 15 more rounds, and those 15 rounds had killed over 100 enemy soldiers. It was enough. While the battle at Firebase Gold raged, Colonel Garth was already coordinating the relief effort. His command helicopter circled the firebase at altitude, Garth watching the battle unfold below, while simultaneously directing reinforcements and air support. He could see the VC attack waves forming in the tree line, could see them charging across the open ground, could see them falling as American fire cut them down. He could see that his men were holding, barely, but holding. But he also knew they couldn't hold forever. They needed help. They needed it fast. Garth radioed Lieutenant Colonel Elliott, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, which was approximately 4 kilometers northwest of Firebase Gold, on their search and destroy mission. "This is Iron 6, Garth transmitted using his call sign. "Firebase Gold is under heavy attack by estimated regimental-size force. I need your battalion at Firebase Gold immediately. Double-time march. Fight through any resistance. Get there as fast as you can. How copy?" Elliott's response came back immediately. "Iron 6, this is Steel 2-6. Roger, understand. Moving to Firebase Gold now. We'll be there as fast as we can make it." Elliott began issuing orders to his companies, even as he was still talking to Garth. The battalion turned in its tracks and started moving toward Firebase Gold at the fastest pace they could manage through the jungle. Garth then contacted the mechanized and armor battalions to the south. Lieutenant Colonel Julian's 2nd of the 22nd Mechanized Infantry and Lieutenant Colonel Staley's 2nd of the 34th Armor had been trying to push north to link up with Elliott's battalion for a coordinated sweep. They were on the wrong side of the Suoi River, but they had the firepower that could break the enemy assault. They had M113 armored personnel carriers and M48 Patton tanks. If they could reach Firebase Gold, they could turn the battle. "Steel 2-2, Steel 3-4, this is Iron 6, Garth transmitted. "Firebase Gold is under heavy attack. I need you across that river and at Firebase Gold soonest. Find a crossing. Force a crossing if you have to. But get moving now." Both battalion commanders acknowledged. Julian and Staley had been scouting the river for over an hour, looking for a suitable ford. The Suoi wasn't a major river, maybe 30 meters wide at most points, but it was deep, and the current was swift. The mechanized infantry's M113s could swim across, theoretically, but river crossings were always dangerous and slow. The tanks couldn't swim at all. They needed a ford where the water was shallow enough that they could wade across without flooding their engines. Julian made the decision. They'd force a crossing at a spot his scouts had identified. The water was deeper than ideal, maybe 6 feet in the center of the channel, but it was the best they were going to find. And with Firebase Gold under attack, they didn't have time to keep looking. Meanwhile, Garth was also coordinating air support. He'd already called for fighter bombers, and they were inbound. F-4 Phantoms from Bien Hoa Air Base, loaded with bombs and napalm, their pilots eager to support the troops on the ground. Garth would direct them personally, marking targets with smoke grenades dropped from his helicopter, talking the fast movers onto enemy positions. He also called for gunship support. Cobra attack helicopters, armed with miniguns and rocket pods, could provide close air support that was more precise than fast movers. The Cobras could orbit the firebase, engaging targets of opportunity, supporting the defenders with continuous fire. Several Cobras were already inbound, their pilots monitoring the radio traffic, understanding the desperate situation, pushing their helicopters to maximum speed. And Garth called for medevac helicopters. There were going to be casualties, lots of them. The wounded needed to be evacuated to hospitals as quickly as possible. But the medevac birds couldn't land at Firebase Gold while the battle was raging. They'd have to wait, orbiting nearby, ready to come in the moment the situation stabilized enough to allow them to land. Finally, Garth coordinated with other artillery fire bases in the region. Firebase Gold's own artillery was firing in self-defense, but other fire bases could bring fire to bear on enemy assembly areas, on likely withdrawal routes, on reinforcement routes. Artillery from multiple locations began firing missions, high explosive rounds falling in the jungle around Firebase Gold, disrupting enemy forces, preventing reinforcements from reaching the attacking units. Garth was doing everything a brigade commander could do, orchestrating a combined arms defense, bringing every available resource to bear on the enemy. But in the end, it would come down to the men at Firebase Gold and the relief forces racing to their aid. If help arrived in time, they'd win. If not, Firebase Gold would fall, and hundreds of Americans would be killed or captured. Lieutenant Colonel Elliott's 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry started moving toward Firebase Gold at 0655 hours, just minutes after receiving Colonel Garth's orders. They were 4 kilometers away through dense jungle. 4 kilometers might not sound like much, but in the jungle of Warzone C, it might as well have been 40. The vegetation was thick, the terrain was broken, and there were almost certainly enemy forces between them and the firebase. Elliott made the decision to move in a tactical column, companies in a file, moving as fast as possible while maintaining the ability to deploy if they hit resistance. Alpha Company led, Captain Stephen Williams commanding. Bravo and Charlie companies followed. Delta Company and the battalion command group brought up the rear. Over 600 men moving through the jungle, all of them understanding that their brothers at Firebase Gold were fighting for their lives and needed help now. The pace was brutal. The soldiers were moving at a fast walk, almost a jog in places where the jungle was thinner, carrying 40 to 60 pounds of equipment and ammunition, sweating profusely in the humid heat. Platoon leaders pushed their men hard, urging them forward, allowing no straggling. The battalion couldn't afford to leave anyone behind, but they also couldn't afford to slow down. They'd moved about a kilometer when Alpha Company's point element spotted enemy soldiers ahead. A squad-size group, maybe 10 VC, moving through the jungle perpendicular to the American column. The point man, Specialist 4 James Thompson, froze and signaled contact. His team leader moved forward, assessed the situation, then made a quick decision. They couldn't bypass this enemy force, couldn't risk leaving them in position where they might ambush the following companies. They had to engage. Thompson opened fire with his M16, dropping 2 VC soldiers immediately. The rest of his team joined in, a sudden explosion of gunfire that killed or wounded most of the enemy squad within seconds. The few survivors ran, disappearing into the jungle. The engagement had lasted maybe 30 seconds. Thompson's team conducted a quick search of the bodies, finding documents and a map that indicated this was a VC blocking force, one of several, positioned to delay any American reinforcements trying to reach Firebase Gold. Alpha Company kept moving, now on full alert, knowing they'd encounter more enemy forces. 5 minutes later, they did. This time it was a larger force, maybe platoon size. VC soldiers dug in along a small ridgeline, positioned to ambush anyone using the trail below. But Alpha Company wasn't using the trail. They were moving parallel to it, through the jungle, and they spotted the ambush position before walking into it. Captain Williams quickly organized an assault. First platoon would fix the enemy with fire from the front. Second platoon would flank left and assault from that direction. Third platoon would be the reserve. It was a simple plan, classic infantry tactics, and Williams executed it quickly without elaborate preparation. The assault went in the fast and violent. First platoon opened fire, their M16s and M60s hammering the enemy position. The VC returned fire, AK-47s cracking, but they were focused on the threat to their front. Second platoon swung wide, moving through heavy vegetation, approaching the enemy position from the flank. When they were in position, the platoon leader gave the signal and they charged, firing as they advanced, throwing grenades, screaming war cries. The VC tried to shift their fires to meet this new threat, but they were too late. Second platoon hit them in the flank, rolling up their position, killing the enemy soldiers in their fighting holes. Within 5 minutes, the enemy position was overrun. Alpha Company had taken 3 casualties, all wounded, none critically. The VC had lost at least 20 killed, the rest fleeing into the jungle. The battalion kept moving. Behind Alpha Company, Bravo and Charlie companies heard the firefight ahead. Knew Alpha was engaged, but kept moving forward. They couldn't stop to help. Alpha could handle it. Their job was to keep moving, to get to Firebase Gold. At 0745 hours, the 2nd of the 12th was about 2 kilometers from Firebase Gold. They could hear the battle clearly now, a continuous roar of gunfire and explosions that told them the fight was still raging. They pushed harder, moving even faster, lieutenants and sergeants urging their men forward, knowing every minute counted. Then they hit the main enemy blocking force, a full company of VC soldiers, well-positioned in prepared defenses, with machine guns and RPGs, determined to stop or at least delay the American relief force. Alpha Company took heavy fire immediately, soldiers going down, the rest seeking cover. This wasn't something they could bypass or quickly overrun. This was a serious defensive position that would require a coordinated assault to break through. But they didn't have time for a coordinated assault. Every minute they spent here was another minute. The defenders at Firebase Gold were fighting alone. Captain Williams made a gutsy decision. They were going through this position, and they were going through now. He called for his company to fix bayonets, a command that seemed like something from another era, from World War I or the Civil War, but which still had its place in modern warfare. The soldiers of Alpha Company fixed their bayonets, the long blades locking onto the ends of their M16 rifles. Then Williams gave the order to assault. The company charged forward in line, over 100 men moving together, firing from the hip, screaming, determined to break through the enemy position through sheer aggression and momentum. The VC were shocked. They'd expected the Americans to take cover, to call in artillery and air support, to conduct a careful, methodical assault. Instead, they were being charged by a line of American infantry who seemed to have gone insane, who were running straight at their positions despite heavy fire. The psychological impact was devastating. Some VC soldiers broke and ran. Others stood their ground and were overrun, killed in hand-to-hand combat as the Americans came over their positions. Alpha Company suffered casualties in that charge. 7 men were killed, 14 wounded, but they broke through the enemy position and kept moving. Behind them, Bravo Company passed through their lines and took the lead, Alpha Company now following, evacuating their wounded as they moved, refusing to stop, refusing to slow down. At 08:55 hours, the lead elements of the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, burst out of the tree line and into the clearing at Firebase Gold. They'd covered 4 kilometers through dense jungle, fought through multiple enemy positions, and arrived in just under 2 hours from the time they received the order to move. It was an extraordinary feat of endurance and courage. But the battle at Firebase Gold was still raging, and the 2nd of the 12th immediately joined the fight. While Elliott's battalion was fighting through the jungle, the mechanized and armor battalions were dealing with their own challenges. The Suoi River stood between them and Firebase Gold, and they needed to cross it immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Julian's reconnaissance platoon had found a potential crossing site. The river bent at this point, creating a slightly shallower section where the bottom was gravel instead of mud. The water would still be deep, probably 6 feet in the center, but it was crossable, maybe. Julian gathered his company commanders for a quick briefing. We're going across here, tracks first, they can swim if they have to. Tanks follow, stay in the track's wake, go slow, keep your engine intakes above water. If a vehicle breaks down in the river, we push it out of the way and keep moving. Anyone have questions? No one did. They understood the situation. Firebase Gold needed help now. The river was an obstacle, but it wasn't insurmountable. They'd get across or die trying. The first M113 armored personnel carrier edged down the riverbank and entered the water. The driver revved the engine, the vehicle's tracks churning, keeping it moving forward. Water rose up the sides of the APC, reaching the top of the hull, but the vehicle kept moving, its engine above the waterline, its tracks finding purchase on the river bottom. It climbed out on the far bank, water streaming from its hull, its infantry squad still safely inside. The second APC followed, then the third. One by one, the mechanized battalion's vehicles crossed the river. One APC hit a deep hole in midstream and started to sink, water rushing over the top deck, threatening to swamp the vehicle. The driver gunned the engine desperately, the tracks churning the water to foam, and somehow the APC powered through the hole and made it to the far bank. Water pouring from its hatches, but the crew and passengers all alive. Then came the tanks. The massive M48 Pattons, each weighing 50 tons, entered the water more slowly, their drivers carefully monitoring their instruments, watching the water level, ready to reverse if it got too deep. The lead tank, commanded by Sergeant First Class William Henderson, moved forward carefully, water rising up the tank's glacis plate, reaching toward the driver's hatch. Henderson stood in his commander's cupola, watching the water level, ready to order his driver to back out if it looked like they'd flood. The tank kept moving forward, its powerful engine straining but maintaining power. The water reached its maximum depth, just below the air intake, and then started to recede as the tank climbed the far bank. They'd made it. Henderson felt relief wash over him. One tank across. 29 more to go. The rest of the armor battalion followed, each tank crossing successfully, though several had close calls with deep spots or soft bottom that threatened to bog them down. The entire crossing took 45 minutes, an eternity when they knew their fellow soldiers were fighting for their lives just a few kilometers away. But finally, both battalions were across the river and moving north toward Firebase Gold. The column spread out into attack formation, tanks in front, APCs following, moving as fast as the terrain would allow. They crashed through the jungle, small trees splintering beneath their tracks, brush and vegetation pushed aside by the weight of the vehicles. The noise was tremendous, engines roaring, tracks clattering, and any VC forces in the area would have heard them coming from kilometers away. They didn't care about stealth now. Speed was everything. Surprise was impossible when you were moving a combined mechanized and armored battalion through the jungle. But firepower and shock effect, those they had in abundance. At 0800 hours, the column made contact with enemy forces. RPGs flashed from the tree line, the rocket-propelled grenades streaking toward the American vehicles. One hit an APC, the shaped charge punching through the thin armor, killing 2 soldiers inside and wounding 3 more. But the column didn't stop. The tanks returned fire, their 90mm main guns blasting the tree line with high explosive rounds. The 50s on the APCs opened up, heavy machine gun fire tearing through the jungle. The infantry dismounted under fire, squads leaping from their APCs, forming skirmish lines, advancing into the jungle while their vehicles provided covering fire. The VC blocking force, maybe company size, tried to hold its position, but it was outmatched. American tanks firing at close range, supported by mechanized infantry, were an overwhelming force. The enemy position was overrun within 10 minutes, the survivors retreating deeper into the jungle. The column reformed and kept moving, now just 2 kilometers from Firebase Gold. They could see smoke rising above the trees ahead, could hear the battle clearly. They increased speed, pushing their vehicles to maximum, racing toward their embattled comrades. At 0930 hours, 2 hours, and 59 minutes after the battle began, the soldiers defending Firebase Gold heard a new sound. The distinctive rumble of tank engines, the clatter of tracks on hard ground. Someone yelled, "Tracks inbound!" And for a moment, everyone stopped to look. They came crashing out of the jungle like ancient cavalry, M48 tanks leading, their 90mm guns firing as they advanced. M113 APCs followed, their mounted 50s hammering away, infantry pouring out of their rear hatches, immediately joining the fight. It was one of the most beautiful sights the defenders of Firebase Gold had ever seen. The lead tank, commanded by Sergeant Henderson, burst into the clearing and immediately engaged enemy targets. Henderson spotted a large group of VC soldiers massing for another assault, maybe 40 or 50 men in formation. He ordered his gunner to engage with high explosive. The 90mm gun roared, the round slamming into the enemy formation, the explosion killing at least a dozen. Henderson's loader worked frantically, loading another round. The gun fired again, and again. Other tanks spread out around the perimeter, their commanders identifying targets, engaging with main guns and machine guns. A tank fired its 90mm at a VC machine gun position, the high explosive round obliterating the position. Another tank spotted enemy soldiers trying to flank the fire base and engaged them with its coaxial machine gun, the 30 caliber weapon cutting down enemy soldiers at 300 meters. The mechanized infantry dismounted and immediately moved to reinforce the battered perimeter. They brought fresh troops, fresh ammunition, fresh determination. Squads moved into fighting positions, relieving exhausted defenders, adding their firepower to the battle. Machine gun crews set up their M60s in key positions, adding to the wall of fire that now faced any enemy soldier trying to attack. The VC assault, which had been so close to succeeding, now faced 3 American battalions, supported by armor, artillery, and air power. The mathematics of the battle had shifted decisively. The enemy regimental commander, observing from his command post, realized his attack had failed. He'd committed everything, had thrown wave after wave of soldiers at Firebase Gold, had taken horrific casualties, and still the Americans held. Now, with reinforcements arrived and armor on the battlefield, there was no chance of success. He ordered his remaining forces to break contact and withdraw. But withdrawing under fire is one of the most difficult military operations. The VC soldiers, many of them already exhausted and demoralized from the heavy casualties they had suffered, tried to fall back to the jungle. American fire pursued them, machine guns and artillery cutting down retreating soldiers. Some made it back to the tree line and disappeared into the jungle. Many did not. One final enemy assault came in from the northeast. 2 fresh companies that the VC commander committed in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the battle. Over 300 men charged out of the jungle, firing as they came, trying to overrun the American positions through sheer determination. They ran into a perfect storm of American firepower. The artillery fired beehive rounds directly into the charge, multiple guns firing simultaneously, tens of thousands of flechettes shredding the attacking formation. The tanks engaged with main guns and machine guns. The mechanized infantry added their fire. The defending infantry, now reinforced and resupplied with ammunition, poured fire into the enemy formation. Overhead, a Cobra gunship rolled in, its minigun howling, adding to the storm of fire. The enemy charge disintegrated. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Those who survived tried to retreat, but they were caught in the open, fully exposed, and American fire cut them down without mercy. Within 5 minutes, the entire assault force had been destroyed. Bodies carpeted the ground, piled so thick in some places that you couldn't walk without stepping on corpses. That was the last attack. By 1000 hours, 3.5 hours after it began, the Battle of Firebase Gold was over. As the firing died down, the grim task of casualty assessment began. Medics moved through the firebase, treating wounded, prioritizing the most serious cases for immediate medevac. The battalion aid station was overwhelmed, wounded men lying on the ground outside, because there was no room inside. Doctors and medics worked frantically to stabilize patients, starting IVs, applying tourniquets, treating sucking chest wounds, doing everything they could to keep men alive long enough to get them to a hospital. Medevac helicopters began landing, flying into Firebase Gold despite occasional sniper fire from the tree line, hovering just long enough for wounded to be loaded aboard, before lifting off again. The most seriously wounded went first, men with chest wounds, abdominal wounds, traumatic amputations, massive blood loss. Some men died waiting for the helicopters, their wounds too severe, their bodies too broken to survive. Medics did what they could, holding dying men's hands, offering what comfort they could, ensuring no one died alone. The initial casualty count was sobering. 31 Americans killed during the battle itself. Another 5 would die of wounds over the next few days, men who made it to hospitals but whose injuries were too severe to survive. The final death toll reached 36 soldiers. 190 men were wounded, ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic injuries that would leave men permanently disabled. Every unit engaged in the battle had taken losses. The 3rd of the 22nd Infantry, which had borne the brunt of the initial assault, lost 19 men killed and over 70 wounded. Company B, Captain Hemphill's unit, was particularly hard hit, with nearly 40% casualties. The artillery battalion lost 11 men killed and 30 wounded, their gun crews having fought at point-blank range throughout the battle. The 2nd of the 12th Infantry, which had fought through the jungle to reach Firebase Gold, lost 6 men killed and 21 wounded during their approach march and subsequent fighting. Among the dead was Sergeant First Class William Henderson, the squad leader who'd been checking his men's fighting positions the day before, who'd been counting down the days until he could return to his wife and 2 children. He'd been killed early in the battle, shot while leading a counterattack against enemy forces that had breached the perimeter. His body was recovered and evacuated with the other fallen, wrapped in a poncho, tagged, flown back to Graves registration at Bien Hoa. Eventually, his remains would be flown back to the United States, to Fort Lewis, where his widow would receive the flag that had covered his coffin and try to explain to their young children that Daddy wasn't coming home. Specialist 4, Robert Martinez, the machine gunner who'd shared a fighting position with Private Wilson, had been wounded twice during the battle, but had refused evacuation, continuing to fire his M60 until he physically couldn't continue. He'd been medevaxed with shrapnel wounds in his leg and shoulder, burns on his hands from handling the hot machine gun barrel. He would recover and eventually return to duty, but he'd carry scars from Firebase Gold for the rest of his life. Private First Class David Wilson had survived unwounded, one of the lucky ones. He'd fired over 500 rounds from his M16 during the battle, had thrown probably a dozen grenades, had seen men killed within meters of his position. He was numb, in shock, unable to fully process what he'd just experienced. In the days after the battle, he would have nightmares, would wake up screaming, would struggle to reconcile the fact that he'd killed other human beings, that he'd survived when so many others hadn't. But as heavy as American casualties were, enemy losses were catastrophic. As soldiers moved outside the wire to begin battlefield clearance operations, the true scale of the VC defeat became apparent. Bodies were everywhere, piled in front of defensive positions, scattered across the clearing, heaped along the tree line where beehive rounds had caught them. In some places, the dead were stacked 3 and 4 deep, testimony to the desperate nature of the enemy attacks and the effectiveness of American defensive fire. The count grew throughout the day. 100 dead, 200, 300. Soldiers moved through the battlefield, checking bodies, confiscating weapons, searching for documents. Some enemy soldiers were still alive, wounded, unable to escape. They were treated by American medics and evacuated as prisoners. Others had died of their wounds, their bodies already starting to bloat in the tropical heat. The final official count reached 647 Viet Cong killed in action, their bodies physically counted and documented. But intelligence officers believed the real number was much higher. Blood trails led away from the battlefield in dozens of directions, suggesting hundreds more had been wounded, many of them probably mortally. VC doctrine emphasized recovering their dead and wounded, and they'd certainly done so during lulls in the fighting and after the battle ended. Captured prisoners later revealed that the 272nd Regiment had suffered over 1,500 casualties during the battle, effectively destroying it as a combat effective force. Weapons recovery was equally impressive. The Americans collected 65 crew-served weapons, including heavy machine guns, mortars, and RPG launchers, plus 94 individual weapons. The sheer quantity of equipment the VC had brought to the battle indicated they'd planned for a sustained fight and expected to capture the American weapons and ammunition stockpiled at Firebase Gold. The captured weapons were examined by intelligence specialists. Many were Chinese or Soviet-made, supplied through North Vietnam and smuggled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Some were captured American weapons, M16s and M60s taken from battlefields or supplied by corrupt South Vietnamese officials. The VC were well-armed, well-trained, and had fought with tremendous courage. They'd just been outfought by American soldiers who refused to give up. One task remained before Firebase Gold could return to normal operations. The dead had to be buried. The American dead were being evacuated by helicopter, but 647 enemy bodies couldn't be left to rot in the tropical sun. The health hazard alone would be enormous, and the smell of decomposing corpses would make the firebase uninhabitable. Engineers brought in bulldozers and began digging 2 massive graves, each one 20 meters long, 5 meters wide, and 3 meters deep. The graves were positioned just outside the firebase perimeter, in areas that hadn't been heavily fought over. Work parties of American soldiers were organized to carry the enemy dead to the burial sites. It was hard, gruesome work that no one wanted to do, but it had to be done. Soldiers moved through the battlefield, 2 men to a body, carrying the dead VC soldiers to the graves. Many of the bodies had been torn apart by beehive rounds or high explosive shells. The tropical heat had already started the process of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming, making men gag and vomit, but the work continued. Some soldiers searched the bodies before burial, looking for documents, diaries, anything that might provide intelligence value. They found letters from home, photographs of families, personal items that humanized the enemy's soldiers. These were men who'd believed in their cause enough to die for it, who'd had hopes and dreams and families just like the Americans who'd killed them. War was like that, turning human beings into targets, making killing a necessity for survival. The work continued for hours, body after body carried to the graves. When the graves were full, the bulldozers pushed earth over them, covering the dead. There would be no markers, no ceremony, no individual recognition. Just 2 massive graves in a jungle clearing that held the remains of over 600 Vietnamese soldiers who died trying to overrun an American firebase. Years later, after the war ended, Vietnamese recovery teams would search for these graves, trying to identify remains, trying to give families closure. Some remains would be recovered and identified through painstaking forensic work. Others would remain unknown soldiers, their families never learning exactly what happened to them, carrying the pain of uncertainty for the rest of their lives. War creates grief on both sides, and the Battle of Firebase Gold left its share of grief in Vietnamese villages. Families mourning sons and husbands who'd left for war and never returned. General William Westmoreland, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, flew to Firebase Gold the day after the battle. His helicopter landed in the clearing, still pocked with mortar craters, still showing the scars of combat. Westmoreland walked among the soldiers, shaking hands, offering congratulations, personally thanking men for their courage and sacrifice. He inspected the battlefield, saw the captured weapons, looked at the artillery pieces that had saved the firebase, their barrels still discolored from heat, their crews exhausted but proud. He spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Vesey, learning about the artillery tactics that had been used, about the beehive rounds that had proven so devastating. He talked with Captain Hemphill about the infantry defense, about how Company B had held against overwhelming odds. Westmoreland told the assembled soldiers what they already knew. They'd won a great victory. They'd defeated a major enemy assault. They'd inflicted the highest enemy casualties of any single engagement in the war to date. The 272nd Regiment, once a feared fighting force, had been effectively destroyed. It was a triumph of American arms, a vindication of American tactics and firepower. But Westmoreland also acknowledged the cost. 36 Americans had died. Over 200 had been wounded. These men had paid in blood for the victory. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. In the weeks and months that followed, recommendations for awards and decorations were processed. Lieutenant Colonel Vesey received the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism. The citation detailed his actions during the battle, how he'd moved under fire to rally his artillerymen, how he'd personally engaged enemy positions, how he'd saved explosive-filled drums from a fire at great personal risk, how his leadership had been instrumental in the defense of Firebase Gold. Captain Hemphill received the Silver Star for leading Company B's defense. Numerous soldiers received Bronze Stars with V device for valor. Specialist Martinez received one for continuing to fight despite being wounded twice. Sergeant Mitchell, the artillery NCO who'd fired the first beehive round, received one for his actions manning his howitzer throughout the battle. Dozens of other soldiers received similar recognition for specific acts of courage. But the highest honor came in October 1968, when President Lyndon Johnson awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the entire 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, and all attached and assigned units that had participated in the battle. The Presidential Unit Citation is the highest award given to a military unit, and it recognized that every soldier who'd been at Firebase Gold, from the brigade commander to the newest private, had demonstrated extraordinary heroism. The citation read, in part, "The 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, and the attached and assigned units distinguished themselves by extraordinary heroism while engaged in military operations on 21 March 1967 in Suoi, Republic of Vietnam. During the early morning hours, the Viet Cong 272nd Main Force Regiment, reinforced, launched a massive and determined ground attack and overran elements of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, and 2nd Battalion. 77th Artillery, located at Fire Support Base Gold near Suoi, Republic of Vietnam. Every soldier who'd fought at Firebase Gold was authorized to wear the Presidential Unit Citation streamer on his uniform, a visible reminder of his participation in one of the most significant battles of the Vietnam War. For many of them, it was the proudest moment of their military service, recognition that they had stood and fought when the situation seemed hopeless, that they'd held the line, that they'd won. The Battle of Suoi had a significant impact on American tactics for the rest of the Vietnam War. The devastating effectiveness of the beehive round led to its widespread adoption throughout Vietnam. Every firebase stockpiled beehive rounds. Artillery crews trained extensively in their use. Defensive plans specifically incorporated beehive fires as a primary means of defeating enemy assaults. The battle also demonstrated the importance of combined arms operations. Infantry, artillery, armor, mechanized infantry, and aviation had all worked together seamlessly. Each element had supported the others, creating a synergistic effect that multiplied American combat power. This became the model for future operations, with units training together, rehearsing combined arms tactics, ensuring everyone understood how to support each other in combat. The rapid reinforcement by the 2nd of the 12th Infantry showed the critical importance of speed and relief operations. Lieutenant Colonel Elliott's decision to move his battalion through the jungle at maximum speed, fighting through enemy positions rather than trying to bypass them, had probably saved Firebase Gold from being overrun. This lesson was incorporated into training with emphasis on rapid movement to contact, aggressive tactics, and the understanding that sometimes speed is more important than caution. The battle also highlighted the value of professional soldiers and strong leadership at every level. From Colonel Garth coordinating the overall defense to Sergeant Henderson leading his squad in a counterattack, leadership had made the difference. The soldiers at Firebase Gold had been well trained, well led, and well equipped. They had maintained discipline under fire, followed orders, executed their missions. That professionalism had been critical to the victory. But perhaps the most important lesson was one the Viet Cong learned. The battle convinced the VC High Command that they could not defeat American forces in conventional stand-up fights. The casualties they'd suffered at Suoi, combined with losses in other battles during Operation Junction City, were unsustainable. The 272nd Regiment would take months to rebuild, and even then, it would never regain its former strength or morale. After Firebase Gold, the Viet Cong increasingly reverted to guerrilla tactics. They avoided direct confrontation with American units, focusing instead on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, terrorism, and political warfare. They would wait out the Americans, believing that eventually the U.S. would tire of the war and withdraw. And in the end, they were right. But on March 21st, 1967, at Firebase Gold, the Viet Cong learned that in a straight fight, they couldn't defeat American forces. The The veterans of Firebase Gold carried their memories of that day for the rest of their lives. Some thrived after returning home, building successful careers, raising families, living full lives where the war became just one chapter, albeit an important one. They attended reunions, maintained contact with their fellow veterans, took pride in their service. Others struggled. The intensity of the combat, the casualties they'd witnessed, the men they'd killed, left psychological scars that never fully healed. Some turned to alcohol or drugs. Some had difficulty maintaining relationships or holding jobs. Some ended up homeless. In the 1970s, PTSD was barely recognized as a medical condition, and veterans who sought help often found little available. They struggled alone, haunted by memories of a jungle clearing where they'd fought for their lives. Every March at Fort Carson, Colorado, memorial ceremonies honor the soldiers who fought at Suoi. Veterans attend when they can, now elderly men, to stand with active duty soldiers and share their experiences. The young troops listen in awe to stories of 4-hour firefights, of artillery pieces firing beehive rounds at point-blank range, of tanks crashing through the perimeter to save the day. The connection between past and present is maintained. A monument at Fort Carson lists the names of the 36 Americans who died at Firebase Gold. Their names are engraved in stone, ensuring they will be remembered. David Brown, Michael Johnson, William Henderson, James O'Brien. Names that might otherwise be forgotten, young men who died in a jungle clearing on the other side of the world, now memorialized forever. Firebase Gold itself no longer exists. The jungle has reclaimed the clearing, the bunkers have collapsed, the wire has rusted away, the craters have filled in, nature has hidden the scars of battle. If you visited the location today, you'd find only jungle, no indication that one of the most significant battles of the Vietnam War was fought there. But in the memories of those who were there, Firebase Gold remains vivid, real, unforgettable. The Battle of Suoi stands as one of the most significant engagements of the Vietnam War. The casualty ratio, over 20 enemy killed for every American lost, was one of the most lopsided in the entire war. It demonstrated that American forces, properly supported, well-led, and fighting from prepared positions, could inflict devastating casualties even when heavily outnumbered. The battle showcased the devastating effectiveness of the beehive round, a weapon that may have been the single most effective anti-personnel artillery round ever developed. Those 8,000 flechettes per round, fired from multiple guns at point-blank range, created a killing zone that no enemy force could penetrate. The beehive round became a staple of fire-based defense throughout Vietnam, and its psychological impact on enemy forces was as significant as its physical effects. Firebase Gold proved the value of rapid reinforcement and combined arms operations. The quick response by the 2nd of the 12th Infantry and the mechanized and armor battalions turned a potential disaster into a decisive victory. The coordination between infantry, artillery, armor, and air power demonstrated the sophisticated level of tactical proficiency that American forces had achieved. But the battle also demonstrated the human cost of war. 36 Americans died, 220 were wounded. Over 1,500 Vietnamese soldiers were killed or wounded. Behind each of those numbers was a person, a life cut short or forever changed, a family that suffered loss. The victory at Firebase Gold, as complete as it was militarily, came at a terrible price measured in human grief. March 21st, 1967. Firebase Gold. The Battle of Suoi, a day when American soldiers stood against overwhelming odds and refused to break. A day when artillery crews fired beehive rounds at point-blank range and saved their firebase. A day when relief columns fought through the jungle and arrived just in time. A day of incredible courage, devastating violence, and ultimate victory. The men who fought there did their duty. They protected each other. They held the line when holding seemed impossible. They fought with courage and determination. They won. And in doing so, they wrote one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Vietnam War. A chapter that will be remembered as long as soldiers study the art of war and veterans gather to honor their fallen comrades. That is their legacy. That is what we remember. That is the story of the Battle of Suoi, when Firebase Gold nearly fell, but American soldiers refused to let it happen. When beehive rounds tore through enemy formations like giant shotguns. When relieving columns crashed through the jungle to save their brothers. When courage and firepower combined to defeat an enemy that seemed unstoppable. That is the story we tell. So their sacrifice will never be forgotten.